Tonight we slip through the heavy oak doors of the British Museum Reading Room, or perhaps the Manchester Free Library, just as the gas lamps are being lit. Their warm, hissing glow pools on polished walnut tables and catches the gold leaf on endless rows of spines. The air is a specific perfume you can almost taste. Leather bindings, paper dust, coal smoke from the grate, and the faint, clean bite of floor wax. It's a cathedral of knowledge, hushed and reverent. You hear the soft shush of pages turning, the creak of a chair, the quiet, purposeful footsteps of the attendants. You've come for a book, of course. Perhaps a volume of geology, or a novel by Mr. Dickens in its monthly parts. But you have not come merely to borrow. Unbeknownst to you, you have entered an elaborate sorting house, a grand human experiment. You are here to be catalogued. Your mind, your morals, your very soul are about to be assessed, labeled, and given a permanent address within these hallowed walls. The librarian behind the great central desk isn't just a keeper of books. She is a cartographer of character, and she is already looking at you, deciding where you belong. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Because the journey we're beginning tonight isn't just about where they put the books. It's about where they decided to put people. And you, my friend, are about to be filed. You probably wouldn't survive the judgment. The Victorians had a spine of steel when it came to categorizing the world, and they applied that same relentless order to the messy, unpredictable human heart. They believed every person, like every book, had a correct and immutable place. To be misplaced was a kind of moral danger. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand just inside the doorway, feeling the weight of the silence. It's not a peaceful quiet, it's a vigilant one. It's the sound of concentrated thought being monitored. You smooth your coat, wool, decent but not extravagant, and adjust your hat. Your gloves, you note with a pang of anxiety, have a smudge from the omnibus rail. A minor thing. Surely insignificant. You walk toward the central inquiry desk, your boots tapping a too loud rhythm on the marble floor. The librarian does not look up immediately. She is writing in a large, ledger-like book with a practiced, elegant hand. This is your first glimpse of the system, the central register of readers. A mainstream historical fact, but one with profound implications. Every library of note kept one, recording names, addresses, and the titles borrowed. But as you'll learn, the truly fascinating entries were never the book titles alone, they were the coded comments beside them. She finally lifts her gaze. Her hair is pinned severely back, her collar high and stiff. She wears pince-nez spectacles that seem less an aid to vision and more a tool for magnification, for scrutiny. Her eyes are pale, intelligent, and utterly devoid of welcoming warmth. They perform a swift, comprehensive inventory. Your posture, are you slouching? The quality of your stitching, are you prosperous or pretending? The state of your fingernails, are you laboring or lounging? She notes the slight nervousness in your hands. This is the pre-diagnosis. She is, in her mind, a physician of intellect, and you are presenting with symptoms. Many head librarians of this era actively studied the emerging, and wildly unscientific, field of phrenology. They believed the shape of your skull, the prominence of your brow, the width of your jaw, betrayed your innate faculties. Destructiveness, ideality, conscientiousness. She's not just looking at you, she's looking for you. She's searching for the bumps of your character. You state your business, your voice oddly thin in the vast room. You request a specific title. She doesn't answer immediately. Instead, she asks a question, her tone neutral, professional. And for what purpose do you seek this volume, sir? It seems innocuous. A practical query. But it is the first trapdoor. Your answer, whether it's for professional study, for general improvement, or for diversion, will be weighed and measured. A request for a volume on engineering from a man with rough hands is one thing. The same request from a man with the soft hands of a clerk is another entirely. Historians still argue whether this interrogation was a sincere effort to guide readers to suitable material for their station and intellect, or a form of soft social control, a way to keep the ambitious in their place and the radical away from incendiary ideas. The debate hinges on intent, and intent, like a ghost, is frustratingly hard to pin down in the historical record. All you know in this moment is that you are being weighed. And the scales are of her making. Her question hangs in the air, and you fumble for an answer that sounds both earnest and respectable. For general improvement, you manage. It's the safe, Victorian-approved answer, the intellectual equivalent of eating your vegetables. She gives a barely perceptible nod, a tick in her ledger. But that ledger is far more than a list of names and dates. It is the key to the human catalogue, the invisible architecture governing everything in this room. While you see shelves organized by subject and author, she sees a map of minds. Every patron who walks through those doors is slotted into a categorical drawer in her mind long before they touch a book. You have just been preliminarily filed under improvement seeking, but that is just the broadest heading. The real taxonomy is exquisite in its detail, and brutally judgmental. You are not simply a reader. You are a type. The system she employs, passed down from head librarian to head librarian in memoranda and training manuals, divides the human spectrum into manageable, if fictional, categories. There is the morally sound gentleman, allowed near philosophy and history. The diligent artisan, permitted practical manuals on mechanics or agriculture. The frivolous belle, steered firmly toward books of poetry and improving domestic tales, lest her delicate constitution be overtaxed. The romantically susceptible, a dangerous category often applied to young women, who were to be shielded from novels by the Brontes or Byron at all costs, for fear of exciting unhealthy fantasies. Then there are the darker bins, the politically restive, the morbidly inquisitive, the sensuality-prone. These readers are managed with caution, their access to certain shelves subtly, or not so subtly, obstructed. This classification wasn't born from pure imagination. It sprang from the Victorian mania for order, a desperate attempt to impose a Linnaean system on the terrifying, chaotic flood of humanity that the Industrial Revolution and rising literacy had unleashed into the libraries. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this is the 1850 Public Libraries Act, which began the spread of free public libraries across Britain. Almost overnight, librarians, often from genteel or clerical backgrounds, found themselves gatekeepers not for an elite few, but for the bustling, soot-stained, aspirational masses. How to manage them? The answer was to sort them, like geological specimens. Some libraries allegedly used a color-coded ticket system for borrowers, not just for due dates, but tied to their categorized type. A pale yellow ticket might denote safe, juvenile mind, while a gray one could mean requires observation. Your ticket was your passport, and it dictated your intellectual borders. As she turns to fetch your requested book, you glance at the other patrons. A young man in spectacles and a worn but carefully brushed coat pores over a thick volume of political economy. He has been catalogued, you realize. He is the earnest autodidact, allowed this meaty material because his demeanor suggests he will digest it laboriously, not use it as fuel for rabble-rousing. An older lady in fine silk is perusing a volume of landscape prints. She is the patroness of the aesthetic, her wealth and status granting her access to beautiful, unchallenging things. But you see a young woman, her face eager, approach the desk and quietly ask for a novel the librarian deems unsuitable. The librarian's response is a masterclass in genteel denial. I think you would find Mrs. Gaskell's Cranford far more rewarding, my dear. It is so delightfully observant. The girl's shoulders slump. She has been identified as romantically susceptible and rerouted. The system is not just reactive, it is prophylactic, designed to prevent intellectual infection before it can start. Historians still argue whether this rigid taxonomy was a genuine, if misguided, belief in paternalistic stewardship, or a conscious tool for maintaining the social hierarchy. Was it about protecting the vulnerable, or about ensuring the mechanic didn't get ideas above his station, or the shopgirl didn't yearn for a life beyond her reach? The debate often circles around the figure of the librarian herself. Was she a warden, or a shepherd? In this moment, watching her, you see neither. You see an archivist of souls, convinced of her own system's infallibility. She returns with your book, her movements precise. She places it on the desk and opens the central register to your line. She notes the title and the date. But beside it, in a neat, minuscule script, she adds an abbreviation. A code. Perhaps IMP-SEEK, COURT, for improvement seeking, cautious. You have been officially entered into the human catalogue. Your place in the library's universe is now defined. The next step is to discover where, physically, that place is. Your shelf awaits. The book is before you, but the transaction isn't over. The librarian's hand rests on the ledger, her finger lightly tapping the code she's just inscribed beside your name. Her gaze lifts from the page and settles back on you, not on your eyes, but on your face as a whole. This is the librarian's diagnostic gaze, a second, more intimate assessment. The initial sorting was based on your stated purpose and obvious social markers. Now, she is reading the subtler text of your person. It is a silent, sweeping scrutiny that feels both scientific and deeply intrusive. You instinctively stand a little straighter under its pressure. She is noting the finer details. The slight wear on your right sleeve, suggesting you spend time at a desk. The way you hold your hands, are they clasped respectfully, or shoved nervously in your pockets? You've wisely kept them at your sides. The quality of your shave. The steadiness of your breath. Is there a faint scent of tobacco or workshop oil about you? Every datum is a clue. Victorian librarians were trained to be human microscopes. Many kept private journals, not of library business, but of patron character studies, refining their diagnostic skills. The belief in nervous tells. A slight tremor when requesting a book on anatomy might indicate a prurient rather than a medical interest. A too enthusiastic request for travelogues could betray an unhealthy restlessness, a dissatisfaction with one's God-given place in England. You remember the smudge on your glove. Her eyes flick to it, then away. It is logged. Soiled glove, left index finger. It might be interpreted as carelessness, or worse, as evidence of manual labor you're trying to conceal with middle-class attire. The mainstream historical context here is the explosive growth of the middle class itself, a vast, anxious group defined by performance and perception. The library was a stage where one's claim to respectability and intellect had to be proven. The librarian was the critic. Her gaze was the instrument that separated the genuine article from the pretender. For her, a man's character was as legible as the title on a spine, if one knew how to look. She finally speaks, her voice still low, but now it carries the weight of her verdict. You may take your book to the seating in the North Gallery, she says, with a slight emphasis on the location. It is not a suggestion. It is a directive. It is the physical manifestation of your categorization. The North Gallery, you will learn, is reserved for readers of a steady, improvement-focused disposition. The lighting is good, the tables are sturdy, and the shelves nearby contain works of history, biography, and sober natural philosophy, the intellectual diet prescribed for your type. You are not permitted to wander to the more plush, secluded alcoves of the South Gallery, where novels and books of poetry reside, lest your focus be tempted away. Nor are you to venture near the side tables where periodicals and newspapers are laid out, as that fosters a fragmentary, unserious mind. Historians still argue whether this spatial policing was about maximizing the serene efficiency of the reading room or about enforcing a moral geography. Was seating you in the North Gallery about giving you the best light for your studies, or was it about isolating you from more dangerous influences, ensuring your intellectual development followed a straight, narrow, and approved path? The debate often hinges on the architectural plans of these libraries, which reveal a startling intentionality in sightlines and compartmentalization. The librarian, in assigning your seat, isn't just telling you where to sit. She is telling you who you are, and who you must be for the duration of your stay. Her diagnostic gaze has concluded its assessment. The prescription has been written. All that remains is for you to follow the dosage instructions. You take your book, feeling its weight differently now. It is no longer just a source of information. It is a prop in a performance of categorized selfhood, and she is the director, watching from her desk to ensure you stick to the script. You walk toward the North Gallery, the librarian's gaze like a gentle but persistent pressure between your shoulder blades. The vast room unfolds around you, a labyrinth of knowledge now revealed as a labyrinth of identity. Each bank of shelves, each reading alcove, each long oak table is not a neutral space. It is a neighborhood. And you have just been told your new address. This is a shelf of your own, the physical culmination of the silent judgment passed at the desk. You are about to be nestled among your intellectual and moral kin, the books and, by extension, the other readers deemed to be of your type. The North Gallery is hushed, the air slightly cooler. The light slants in from high windows, falling in bright, dust-moted rectangles on the long tables. Men, and they are almost all men here, sit in disciplined isolation, each in his own pool of quiet. You find an empty seat, the chair scraping softly on the floor. You place your book down, but your eyes are drawn to the shelves immediately flanking your position. This is your assigned literary ecosystem. To your left, a multi-volume history of Rome, Gibbon's decline and fall. Serious, monumental, a warning about the frailties of empire. To your right, a series of green-bound treatises on geology, Lyell's Principles. It speaks of deep time, of patient observation, of a world ordered by slow, immutable laws. Ahead, within easy sightline, are biographies of worthies, great engineers, pious statesmen, explorers of empire. The message is clear, the curation intentional. You are surrounded by narratives of rationalism, disciplined study, and public service. This is the approved diet for the improvement-seeking, cautious mind. It is meant to fortify, not to inflame. This spatial logic was a mainstream feature of Victorian library design. The trend was toward compartmentalization, moving away from the single, vast hall. Architects like Sir Anthony Panizzi, who designed the British Museum Reading Room's famous circular space, were obsessed with reader control and efficient book retrieval. But that efficiency had a social dimension. Placing certain books near certain types of readers was a form of behavioral nudging, Victorian style. Some librarians would even seed shelves. A particularly worrisome romantically susceptible patron assigned to the North Gallery might find a volume of deeply boring agricultural statistics deliberately placed next to the poetry she requested, a hint so broad it was a brick wall. You glance at your neighbor 2 seats down. He is a man in his 40s with a neat, graying beard, engrossed in a thick volume on bridge construction. You have never spoken, but in the librarian's ledger, you are likely cousins. Your codes share a familial resemblance. He is probably diligent, professional, stable. You are both deemed safe, predictable, your intellectual currents flowing in calm, useful channels. There is a comfort in this, you have to admit. A sense of order. You belong. But the belonging is conditional on conformity. To reach for a book from the distant, warmer-looking alcove of the South Gallery would be a transgression, a betrayal of the character you have been assigned. It would draw notice. It would be logged. Historians still argue whether this enforced neighborhood fostered a sense of communal intellectual endeavor or simply created silent, ghettoized enclaves of like-mindedness, stifling the serendipitous, cross-pollinating encounters that are the true lifeblood of a library. Was the young clerk sitting among biographies of industrialists inspired to rise, or was he being told, subtly but constantly, to admire from a distance? The debate is mirrored in the very shelves. Are they a gathering place for ideas, or are they silos? As you open your own book, you feel the peculiar weight of this assigned place. You are not just reading history, you are sitting in its designated section. Your thoughts, for this hour at least, are expected to flow along the channels carved by the books that surround you. You have a shelf of your own, and its boundaries are the edges of your permitted curiosity. The initial anxiety of being assessed begins to fade, replaced by a strange, quiet acceptance of your place. You are in your niche. Your book is open. Around you, the silent, concentrated industry of other categorized minds provides a steady, rhythmic backdrop, the turning of a page, the soft scratch of a pencil note. This order feels ancient, immutable, like the laws of physics. But it wasn't. This entire system, this science of shelving, was a frantic, fabricated innovation, a dam built against a rising tide of ink and anxiety. To understand why a librarian would feel compelled to map your personality, you need to step back from the hushed gallery and feel the Victorian panic that birthed it. Imagine the sheer, terrifying flood. The Public Libraries Act of 1850, that mainstream historical milestone, flung open the doors. The steam-powered printing press was churning out material at an unprecedented rate, not just improving works, but sensational penny dreadfuls, radical political pamphlets, romantic novels, controversial scientific treatises. Literacy was climbing. A newly literate populace, from factory workers to shop girls, was entering these once quiet sanctuaries, hungry for words. To the established custodians of culture, often clergymen's daughters or retired scholars serving as librarians, this wasn't progress, it was an invasion. How could they possibly guide this teeming, untrained horde? How to prevent a morally fragile housemaid from picking up a French novel and having her virtue unravel? How to stop a disgruntled laborer from finding marks and fomenting revolution? The answer was to create a science, a taxonomy of the mind itself. They reached for the fashionable sciences of the day. Phrenology, the belief that brain function shaped the skull, was a major influence. A librarian might note a patron's large anterior lobe, indicating intellect, or prominent organ of amativeness, indicating dangerous passion. More subtly, they absorbed the language of early psychology and social Darwinism. Readers weren't just individuals, they were types on an evolutionary and moral scale. The system borrowed from botanical classification, medical diagnosis, and even the new field of criminology. Cesare Lombroso's idea of the born criminal had a perverse mirror in the idea of the born frivolous reader. A messy, pseudoscientific stew served up as objective truth. Some library manuals included literal diagrams of reader species, with flowcharts for diagnosis. The goal was control through categorization. If you could diagnose a reader, you could prescribe their reading. The library became a clinic for the intellect. The shelves were the pharmacy, and the librarian was the doctor, dispensing moral and mental hygiene in careful doses. This wasn't merely about organizing books, it was about organizing reactions to books. They believed a violent temper could be inflamed by a history of war, or soothed by devotional poetry. They thought a melancholic disposition required bright books of travel, not deep philosophy. Your place in the North Gallery, then, isn't an accident. It's a therapeutic placement. The solid, grounding histories and sciences around you are the treatment for your diagnosed condition of cautious improvement seeking. You are being given a mental tonic. Historians still argue whether this science was a sincere, if profoundly mistaken, application of contemporary thought, or a cynical facade for class-based control. Was the librarian a misguided social physician, or a gatekeeper using the latest jargon to lock the gates? The debate is tangled in the earnest, verbose reports head librarians wrote, filled with phrenological terms and moral certainty. They genuinely believed they were doing good, protecting society and the individual from the perils of unguided reading. As you sit there, the subject of this grand, flawed experiment, the weight of their conviction settles around you. The silence isn't just for concentration, it's the sound of a massive, invisible machine at work, the machinery of the science of shelving, humming softly as it sorts the human soul. Your focus deepens, the words on the page beginning to swim into coherent thought. But just as you settle, a faint, discordant sound reaches you, a muffled, passionate discussion, quickly hushed. It comes from the far end of your gallery, near a wrought iron staircase that spirals up to a balcony level. You glance up. The balcony is shadowy, its shelves less regimented, the books there clad in darker, plainer bindings. A sign, discreet but firm, is fixed to the staircase's newel post. Access by permission of the head librarian only. You have found the border. You are looking at the forbidden aisles. Every library has them. Not officially, of course. There's no public catalog entry for dangerous ideas. But every librarian of this era maintained a shadow collection, a kind of intellectual quarantine zone. The material up there varies, but its common trait is that it is considered inflammatory. It's not just the obvious suspects, political anarchism, atheistic philosophy, or explicit medical texts. The criteria are infuriatingly subjective. A novel deemed to preach immoral social choices, like Hardy's Tess of the d'Urbervilles. A history that casts a beloved national figure in too critical a light. Poetry that explores sensuality too vividly. Even certain advanced scientific works, like those debating evolution, could find themselves relegated to the permission-only shelves, deemed too unsettling for the general, uncategorized mind. This was a mainstream, if discreet, practice. The mainstream historical fact is the existence of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Catholic Church's list of forbidden books, which influenced Protestant sensibilities too. Public libraries, while not following the index directly, had their own unwritten lists. They faced constant pressure from local councillors, wealthy donors, and vocal moral crusaders to protect the public from pernicious literature. The quirky, fringe element was how they decided what was perilous. Sometimes it was based on a single scandalized review in the quarterly. Sometimes it was the personal whim of a long-serving head librarian, a man who decided, for instance, that any book with the word socialism in its title was a gateway to chaos. There are tales of librarians who would physically deface controversial books, razoring out pages, blotting words, before shelving them, a kind of literary surgery to remove the infected tissue. You see movement. The head librarian herself ascends the spiral stairs, followed by a man you recognize, the local doctor, a person of respected status. He is granted passage. They disappear into the gloom. He is being trusted with the forbidden knowledge. His profession, his class, his character, as determined by the library's science, have earned him a visa into the intellectual quarantine zone. You, with your smudged glove and cautious designation, would be denied at the foot of the stairs. The system isn't just about guiding you toward good things, it's about actively walling you off from the bad, as defined by an opaque authority. The Forbidden Isles are the negative image of your safe north gallery. They define your intellectual world by showing you its limits. Historians still argue whether these restricted sections were a responsible form of custodianship, keeping genuinely dangerous, factually incorrect, or socially destabilizing material in check but available to qualified researchers, or a blatant tool of censorship and information control. Was it protecting the public, or infantilizing them? The debate often focuses on what was actually placed there. Surviving accession logs show surprising titles tucked away, not just polemics, but pioneering works of sociology, anthropology, and psychology that simply challenged conventional Victorian mores. As you watch the librarian and the doctor descend some minutes later, the doctor clutching a volume tightly, you realize the Forbidden Isles didn't just contain books. They contained power, the power to decide who was mature enough, sound enough, worthy enough to handle certain thoughts. And that power rested entirely in the diagnostic gaze you had just endured. The doctor passes your table, the forbidden book tucked under his arm, its plain cover offering no clue. He doesn't meet your eye. There's a slight possessiveness in his grip, a consciousness of privilege. You return to your own sanctioned text, but the spell of quiet study is broken. You are now acutely aware of the machinery around you. Every sigh, every request at the central desk, every returned book is part of a vast, silent ledger. You are not just being shelved, you are being watched. This is a system of surveillance, and its purpose is to build a permanent record, a character dossier written not in ink alone, but in the patterns of your curiosity. The central register is only the surface. You see the librarian now, not just gazing at patrons, but constantly writing. She notes when a reader shifts seats. She observes which shelves they browse during a break from their main text. If you were to get up and wander toward the periodicals, she would see it. If you lingered too long in front of the travel section, dreaming of places you'll never go, she might interpret it as wanderlust and adjust your code. Junior assistants move through the galleries like silent sentinels, reshelving books, but also observing who is talking, who looks agitated, who is reading with what the manuals called unhealthy avidity. All of it feeds back to the ledger. The mainstream historical mechanism for this was the ticket system. You surrendered a personal ticket when you borrowed a book, and it was stored in a pocket attached to the book's own card. This created a physical link between you and the volume, a trail. But the surveillance went deeper. Many libraries maintained what were euphemistically called supplementary registers, or reader advisory files. These were the true dossiers. Here, the librarian would add qualitative notes. Reader 742 requested Mills on Liberty, appeared agitated during reading, made frequent notes. Or, Reader 319, a young lady, persists in requesting the Brontes, recommended Felicia Hemans instead, seemed dissatisfied. The transformation of reading habits into a moral biometric. Your intellectual fingerprint was being taken, one borrowed book at a time. Imagine that dossier accumulating over years. It wouldn't just list books. It would paint a portrait of a mind's evolution, or its degeneration. A shift from history to political theory might be flagged. A sudden interest in books on mental physiology or nervous disorders would raise a discreet alarm. This file wasn't necessarily private, either. It could be, and was, consulted for character references. A local employer might ask the head librarian informally about a prospective employee's habits. Was he a steady, improving reader? Or did he dabble in unsound material? Your library record could literally affect your employment prospects. In this way, the surveillance bled out of the stacks and into the world, shaping your destiny based on what you were caught thinking about. Historians still argue whether this meticulous record-keeping was a benign, if overzealous, form of reader guidance, allowing the librarian to better suggest books over time, or a chilling precursor to the modern data profile, a system of soft surveillance meant to enforce ideological conformity. Was the ledger a tool for personalized service, or a panopticon logbook? The debate is sharpened by the fact that many of these records were later destroyed, perhaps out of shame, perhaps to protect privacy, leaving only tantalizing fragments. As you sit perfectly still, trying to look diligently absorbed, you feel the weight of the unseen ledger page with your number on it. Every page turn, every glance toward the window, is a data point. You are not just reading a book. You are writing your permanent record in the library's secret vault, one monitored gesture at a time. A commotion, or the closest thing to it permitted here, draws your attention back to the central desk. 2 new patrons have arrived, presenting a live case study in the system's biases. Observe now the bored heiress and the radical clerk. They stand before the librarian's gaze, and you watch the taxonomy engine whir into action, its gears greased not just by pseudoscience, but by unspoken rules of class and gender. First, the heiress. She is a vision of rustling silk and delicate perfume, a young woman accompanied by a maid. Her gloves are pristine, her posture bespeaks luxury and a certain languid expectation. She smiles at the librarian, a confident, society smile. The librarian's expression softens, but into a mask of polite, firm condescension. The heiress asks for something. You catch the words latest novel and something thrilling. The librarian's response is immediate, a well-rehearsed script. Of course, miss. I have the new volume of Mrs. Henry Wood's East Lynne right here. It is most absorbing and beautifully moral. She doesn't consult a catalogue, she prescribes. The heiress's smile falters slightly. She wanted thrills, but she is being given morally sanctioned sentimentality. She is categorized instantly, frivolous belle, wealthy subtype. The system's goal for her is not improvement, but harmless occupation. She is to be kept amused, not enlightened, her mental energies safely channeled into tearful, virtuous melodrama. The mainstream historical context is the concept of separate spheres. The library, a public institution, still enforced this. Books for women were to be anchors, not sails. Now, the clerk. He is young, sharp-faced, his clothes neat but threadbare at the cuffs. He removes his hat with a respectful but not obsequious gesture. He speaks quietly, but you hear political economy and John Stuart Mill. The librarian's body tightens. Her eyes perform a swift audit. The shabby-genteel attire, the intense eyes, the specific request. This is danger. A clerk reading Mill isn't seeking general improvement, he's seeking ammunition. He is slotted, just as quickly, into a different category, politically restive, autodidact. The treatment is different. Instead of a smooth prescription, she becomes obstructive. Mill? I believe his works are currently under review. Perhaps you would find Samuel Smiles's self-help more immediately beneficial. It is so very practical for a young man in your position. It's a masterstroke of class-based shelving. She denies the requested intellectual tool and offers instead a text preaching individual diligence within the system, a message meant to pacify, not empower. Some librarians kept a separate, more severe set of codes for the working and lower middle classes, especially those seeking elevating knowledge. Codes like AP for ambitious poor or DR for discontented reader were used. The heiress's file might note requires light diversion. The clerk's file will likely bear a warning. The system views his aspiration as a pathology to be managed, her boredom as a triviality to be soothed. You watch the outcomes. The heiress accepts the novel with a resigned shrug, her maid trailing her to the plush, segregated ladies' reading corner, a gilded cage within the larger cage. The clerk hesitates, a flush of anger on his cheeks, then accepts the Smiles book with a stiff nod. He is directed not to the North Gallery with you, but to a more exposed, well-monitored table near the desk. His shelf is not one of community, but of isolation and observation. Historians still argue whether this starkly differential treatment was a reflection of the librarian's own internalized class prejudices, or a deliberate social policy enacted at the granular level of book lending. Were they simply creatures of their time, or active agents of social control? The debate is framed by the memos of library committees, which often stress the library's role in promoting social harmony and guiding the tastes of the laboring classes. As the clerk opens his book with palpable frustration, and the heiress sighs over her sanctioned melodrama, you see the system not as a pure science, but as a powerful, biased instrument, playing different tunes for different listeners, all in the key of control. The tension at the desk dissipates, leaving the clerk simmering at his monitored table and the heiress sighing in her corner. The library returns to its orchestrated quiet. But systems, especially human ones, develop cracks. They are run by people, and people are gloriously, messily inconsistent. As you watch a junior assistant, a young woman with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, reshelve books near you, you witness the birth of the crack in the system. It is a small act, almost invisible, but it carries the voltage of quiet rebellion. The assistant moves with the weary efficiency of someone who knows every spine by touch. She holds a small stack of returns. One is a volume you recognize from the clerk's earlier, denied request, Mill's Principles of Political Economy. It should, by the logic of the ledger and the librarian's decree, go to the restricted balcony or at least be held back. The assistant pauses. She glances at the central desk, where the head librarian is now engrossed in correspondence. She then looks across the room at the radical clerk, hunched over the pacifying self-help, his shoulders tight with defeat. A moment of decision flickers across her face. She doesn't take the mill to the forbidden stays. Instead, she carries it to the shelves of the North Gallery, right near where you sit. But she doesn't place it among the economics texts. That would be too obvious. She slides it onto a shelf 2 sections over, nestled between a dense history of the Corn Laws and a volume of bureaucratic reports on urban sanitation. It's a misfile, but a brilliant one. To the head librarian or a casual browser, it looks like a simple error, a book slightly out of place. But to a seeker, to that clerk, if he were to wander the stacks on a pretext, it would be a beacon. Placed among dry, official records, its title would scream out. It is a book left in the wilderness for the right person to find. This was a known, if rarely documented, form of subterfuge. The mainstream historical fact is that junior library staff were often from a wider social background than the head librarians. They were the daughters of tradesmen, the sons of teachers. They mingled with the world outside the oak doors and sometimes sympathized with the hunger they saw on the faces of readers like the clerk. The law of the ghost shelver. The idea among some library historians that certain mysterious, beneficial misfilings in old records were intentional acts of intellectual charity. An assistant might also subtly bend the rules during the initial interview, rephrasing a patron's request to make it sound more acceptable to the head librarian's ears, thus funneling a forbidden book into worthy hands through bureaucratic sleight of tongue. The assistant moves away, her face blank once more. But the crack has been opened. The mill volume now sits like a seed in otherwise barren soil. The system's perfect taxonomy has a flaw. It depends on the complicity of every human cog. And sometimes, a cog has a conscience, or a spark of empathy, or perhaps just a rebellious streak against the sheer joylessness of it all. She has used her intimate knowledge of the system, its categories, its blind spots, its sheer physical layout, to undermine its intent. She hasn't destroyed the machine, she has merely inserted a small, humane contradiction into its logic. Historians still argue whether these acts of benign misfiling were common or romanticized exceptions, the wishful thinking of modern scholars looking for heroes in the stacks. Was there a silent network of junior staff subtly redirecting books, or was it a rare, individual gamble? The debate is difficult to settle because evidence is, by its nature, hidden. You can't find a memo advocating for it. You can only find anomalies in old shelf marks and wonder. As you look at the misplaced volume, its presence feels like a secret. It is a testament to the fact that while the library might try to shelve personalities, it could never fully shelve the human spirit, not even that of its own staff. The crack is small, but it is there, running through the polished marble and the perfect rose, letting in a sliver of unchaperoned light. The assistant's act of quiet defiance hangs in the air, a ghost in the machinery. But such acts are not without cost. To maintain the system requires a certain hardening of the soul, a suppression of instinctive pity or intellectual solidarity. As you watch the head librarian finally close her correspondence and lift her gaze once more to sweep the room, you see not a tyrant, but a weary executor of duty. This is the personal cost of order, the quiet, grinding toll exacted on the very people who uphold the taxonomy. For every book misfiled in rebellion, there are 100 correctly filed in resigned compliance. Her eyes pass over the clerk, still fuming over self-help. For a fleeting second, a different expression crosses her face, not disapproval, but something like regret, or perhaps the echo of a forgotten curiosity. Then it's gone, smoothed into professional neutrality. She must believe in the system, or at least in its necessity, to do her job. But to believe in it, she must routinely crush the very spark she was perhaps once hired to nurture. Imagine the internal ledger she must keep, the bright-eyed young woman she toned away from geology, unseemly for your sex, my dear, the elderly working man she redirected from philosophy. Would you not prefer a nice history of the railways? The clerk she has just steered away from mill. Each interaction is a small act of intellectual pruning, cutting back curiosity to fit a prescribed shape. The mainstream historical reality is that many head librarians, especially women, were deeply educated but trapped by the conventions of their role. They were often the unacknowledged scholars of their community, yet their job was to police the intellectual boundaries of others, boundaries they themselves may have chafed against. They wrote meticulous reports on reader behavior, filled with the approved jargon, while their private diaries, where they exist, sometimes reveal doubt. The evidence of this cost is found in the occasional, startling lapse in the library records themselves. A single, passionate marginal note in a ledger, a pity, scribbled beside the denial of a requested title. Or a novel, clearly meant for a restricted shelf, found logged as issued to a morally sound gentleman with no follow-up, a possible act of exhausted forgiveness. You see her stand and walk slowly along the perimeter of the galleries, her hands clasped behind her back. It's a patrol, but it also seems like a penance. She pauses by the ladies' corner, where the heiress is now pretending to read, and her gaze softens again, this time with something like pity. She knows the novel is pap. She knows the heiress's mind is capable of more. But to give her more would be to risk upsetting the heiress's parents, the library committee, the entire fragile ecosystem of approval in which the library exists. So she condemns the heiress to boredom, and the clerk to frustration, all in the name of order. The weight of these condemnations is hers to carry. Her authority is a cage she also inhabits. Historians still argue whether this internal conflict was a widespread experience or is a sentimental projection onto figures who were, in fact, perfectly contented authoritarians. Did the average librarian lie awake at night troubled by the minds she had gently stunted, or did she sleep soundly, confident in her role as a social guardian? The debate hinges on the scarce personal documents left behind. The system's greatest personal cost may have been the necessity to silence one's own doubts, to become a willing instrument of a logic that could feel, in quiet moments, deeply illogical. As she completes her round and returns to her desk, her posture is perfect, her expression serene. But the performance of absolute conviction is the most telling evidence of the cost. She must wear this mask so convincingly that even she begins to forget it's there. The human cost of shelving personalities wasn't just borne by the readers on the wrong shelf. It was etched into the face of the woman who put them there. The equilibrium of the North Gallery, that steady hum of sanctioned study, is about to be disrupted. The main doors open, letting in a brief gust of damp, sooty air and a new patron. He is an anomaly. A middle-aged man in the practical, sturdy clothes of a prosperous farmer or a ship's captain, but with the relaxed, observant demeanor of a traveler. He walks to the desk not with the clerk's tense ambition or the heiress's bored expectation, but with a calm, unplaceable confidence. He presents a problem. This is when the taxonomy fails, a living specimen that resists the available drawers. You watch, fascinated, as the librarian's diagnostic gaze meets a subject it cannot immediately classify. He requests not one book, but a strange constellation, a recent report on tropical botany, a volume of Persian poetry in translation, and a technical manual on steam engine governors. The combination is nonsensical by the library's categorical logic. Botany is for scientists or gardeners. Persian poetry is for decadent aesthetes or scholars. Steam engines are for engineers. What singular personality could legitimately span these three realms? The librarian is visibly nonplussed. Her fingers hover over her ledger. She cannot simply prescribe. His request is too specific, too oddly coherent in its very incoherence. She asks the standard question, "Might I inquire as to the nature of your study, sir?" His answer is a warm, rumbling chuckle. Curiosity. Pure and simple curiosity. This is the system's kryptonite. Curiosity is not a valid category. It is the wild, untaxonomized force the entire science of shelving was built to contain. The mainstream historical fact is that the Victorian era was, paradoxically, both the age of rigid categorization and the great age of the polymathic amateur, gentleman, and a few ladies, of independent means who studied everything from fossils to folklore. They were walking contradictions to the specialist, compartmentalized mind the library system often tried to foster. The response to such patrons, according to some anecdotes, was to classify them under a catch-all code, eccentric or generalist, unfocused. It was a label of defeat, admitting the system couldn't parse them. The librarian tries. She suggests that the botany report is in the natural philosophy alcove, the poetry in the South Gallery, and the engineering manual in the practical arts section. She is, in effect, trying to dismantle him, to scatter his multifaceted request into the separate shelves where each fragment of his interest belongs. But the man smiles again. "I don't mind the walk," he says cheerfully, and waits. He will not be scattered. He insists on all three, at once. Flustered, she has an assistant retrieve them. But then comes the seating dilemma. Where does a botanical, poetic engineering mind belong? The North Gallery is too somber, the South too frivolous, the practical arts area too vulgar. In a moment of bureaucratic paralysis, she simply directs him to an empty table in a neutral zone, a kind of taxonomic no man's land near a window. He sits, spreads his 3 incompatible books around him, and begins to read them in turn, his face alight with genuine, undirected pleasure. He is a crisis in miniature. His very presence mocks the neat borders of the shelves. He is a living reminder that the human mind is not a series of discrete compartments, but a vibrant, chaotic web of connections. A line of poetry might illuminate a mechanical principle, a botanical detail might solve an engineering problem. The system has no shelf for that. Historians still argue whether these unclassifiable patrons were seen as delightful exceptions or as threats to the system's integrity. Did they represent a glorious ideal of the Renaissance mind, or were they simply considered messy, unserious dabblers? The debate is reflected in the way libraries gradually created general reading areas, not out of respect for polymaths, but as a dumping ground for the categorically inconvenient. As the curious man happily annotates a margin, drawing what looks like a leaf next to a diagram of a pressure valve, you see the system's fragile humanity laid bare. It works only as long as people agree to be simpler than they are. The moment a truly complex mind walks in, the whole beautiful, oppressive fiction trembles. The curious polymath at his window table becomes a quiet spectacle, a symbol of the system's limits. But the implications of this personality shelving don't stay within the library's walls. The judgments formed here, the codes in the ledger, the very idea that one's reading habits defined one's moral and social fitness, began to leak out, seeping into the mortar of everyday Victorian life. This is the ripple beyond the stacks. The library's ledger was not an isolated document, it was a character reference for the world. Consider the clerk, whose file now likely bears a mark of political restiveness. His name, or more precisely his reader number, could be invoked in contexts far from books. If he applies for a position as a secretary to a local MP or a municipal clerk, a discreet inquiry might be made of the head librarian. Is he a steady man? Sound in his views? A note in the supplementary register about his persistent requests for radical economic texts could sink his prospects faster than a poor employment history. Conversely, a reader like you, filed under improvement seeking, cautious, might receive a tacit endorsement. The library's assessment becomes a form of social credit, long before the term was invented. The mainstream historical mechanism for this was the network of local elites. Library committees were comprised of clergy, magistrates, prominent businessmen, and gentry. The head librarian moved in this orbit, her reports and informal opinions carrying weight. Her diagnosis could influence a young person's suitability for a teaching post, or a courtship prospect's reliability. There are accounts of families consulting with librarians about the reading habits of their children's suitors. Was the young man given to novels, or to solid history? The answer could sway a fortune. The extension of this was the belief, held in some quarters, that a person's choice of literature could predict criminality. While never formally adopted, this idea created a ripple of suspicion. A police inspector, investigating a case of seditious graffiti or union organizing, might quietly ask if any local library patrons had been borrowing inflammatory material. The ledger became a potential pre-crime registry. This ripple effect transformed the library from a simple repository into a panopticon central tower, its gaze extending down the high street and into the home. Your intellectual life, as recorded in that secret file, was no longer private. It was a matter of public, or at least, official, record. The very act of browsing a shelf was now a performance for an unseen audience that included your potential employer, your future father-in-law, and the local constable. The science of shelving had exported its taxonomy. People began to internalize it. You might find yourself, in conversation, not just judging a man by his job, but by the kind of books you imagined he should be reading. The system taught everyone to be a part-time librarian, diagnosing the souls of those around them based on a presumed reading list. Historians still argue whether this external influence was an intentional design of the library system or an organic, societal absorption of its logic. Did the architects of the personality shelving intend for their codes to be used as character references, or did a nosy, gossipy, status-obsessed society simply seize upon a new and seemingly objective tool for judgment? The debate is complicated by the fact that librarians themselves sometimes protested these external inquiries, citing reader confidentiality, a fight that marks the early, fragile birth of the concept of intellectual privacy. As you sit in your assigned seat, you realize the stakes are higher than you thought. You're not just building a reading record. You're building a reputation, a civic profile, brick by brick, with every book you are seen to request. The ripples from this quiet room touch shores you cannot yet see. The gaslight begins to dim as the afternoon wanes, casting longer, more dramatic shadows across the ranked shelves. The library's silent drama of categorization feels both eternal and intensely fragile. It's time to pull back, to examine not just the system's mechanics, but the battle over its soul that still rages in quiet academic corners. This is where we enter the scholar's debate. For every clue-cut case of a librarian playing social gatekeeper, there's a confounding counterexample of genuine, if paternalistic, care. The historical record is a palimpsest of conflicting intentions, and modern historians are still scratching at the layers, arguing over what it all meant. Take the case of the romantically susceptible young woman steered away from Bronte. One school of thought, often leaning on feminist and social control theory, sees this as a blatant act of patriarchal repression. The librarian, enforcing the separate spheres, is clipping the wings of a mind that might dream of passion and independence. The denied novel is a locked door. The mainstream historical fact supporting this view is the vast body of Victorian conduct literature explicitly warning women against exciting fiction, tying it to hysteria and moral decay. The librarian was merely an agent of this widespread ideology. But other historians push back. They point to the librarian's own writings, their annual reports filled with earnest language about elevating the public mind and preventing mental harm. From this vantage, the librarian is a social worker, a protector. In an age before content warnings or psychological support, might steering a fragile-seeming person away from emotionally wrenching material have been seen as a kindness? Was it censorship, or a crude form of duty of care? This is the core of the debate: benevolent guidance versus thought control. The element scholars love to dig into is the personal correspondence of librarians, which sometimes reveals this tension in raw form. A letter from a librarian to her sister: "I had to deny poor Miss A the French novel today. She looks so peaky. It would have quite overthrown her, but oh, how I wished I could give her the world instead." Then there's the class argument. Was the redirecting of the clerk from mill to smiles an act of bourgeois social control, keeping the working man in his place? Or was it, in the librarian's mind, a practical act? She might have believed Smiles's gospel of self-improvement through thrift and effort was genuinely the more useful, actionable path for a clerk's life, while Mill's abstractions would only lead to frustration and trouble. Her intent matters, but it's irrecoverable. We have only her actions, and actions are always open to interpretation. Historians still argue whether the system's primary function was to protect the reader, protect society from the reader, or simply bring an anxious sense of order to the chaos of mass literacy. The debate is fueled by the fact that the same library, the same librarian, could likely embody all three motives in a single afternoon, depending on which patron stood before them. The kindly guidance offered to the confused elderly gentleman looks, in another light, exactly like the thought control imposed on the radical clerk. The tool was the same: the diagnostic gaze, the ledger, the assigned shelf. only the target's vulnerability differed. As the shadows merge in the corners of the North Gallery, the system appears not as a monolith, but as a mirror, reflecting the profound Victorian anxieties about democracy, morality, and the untamed power of the printed word. The scholars' debate endures because, in the end, they are arguing over the reflection in that mirror, trying to decide if it shows a guardian, a warden, or a bit of both, looking back at us from the past. The debate among scholars is a flickering fire in a distant study. Here, in the library, the fire is about to be quenched by a deluge. The seemingly immutable system of personality shelving, for all its intricate gears and coded ledgers, was not destined to last. Forces were gathering, far larger than any head librarian's authority, that would unravel the system. You can sense the end of an era in the very air, which is starting to smell less of coal dust and more of something sharp, electric, and new. The first force was sheer, overwhelming volume. The late Victorian and Edwardian periods saw a further explosion in publishing. Cheap, mass-produced paperback novels, pulp magazines, and a torrent of newspapers made the librarian's role as a filter impossible. You couldn't personally assess and shelve the personality of every person buying a penny dreadful at a railway kiosk. The floodgates were open, and the carefully built dam of categorization was simply washed away. The mainstream historical fact here is the rise of publishers like Penguin in the 1930s, whose paperback lines put everything from classics to detective fiction into every hand, bypassing the library gatekeeper entirely. The library's monopoly on access to stories was broken. The second force was intellectual, the collapse of the pseudosciences that underpinned the system. Phrenology was laughed out of serious circles. Psychology began its slow move from moral typology toward understanding the complex, individual mind. The idea that you could diagnose a person's moral character from their brow ridge or their choice in literature began to seem not just arrogant, but absurd. A sign of this shift was the change in library training manuals. Early 20th century editions quietly dropped the chapters on assessing reader character, and replaced them with sections on the new Dewey Decimal System, a method of organizing books, not brains. The focus shifted from the reader to the collection itself. But the great unraveler was the 20th century itself, the cataclysmic break of the First World War. The war did something profound. It shattered the Victorian certainty that society was a stable, classifiable hierarchy. When boys from every social stratum died in the same mud, the idea that a clerk should be steered toward self-help and a gentleman toward Gibbon felt not just outdated, but obscene. The world became too chaotic, too tragic, for such delicate intellectual gardening. Furthermore, the war created a massive demand for simple, undemanding distraction for convalescing soldiers. Libraries were pressured to provide easy, entertaining reads without moral scrutiny. The personality shelving system, built on paternalistic judgment, crumbled in the face of a national need for comfort without conditions. You can see the early cracks in your own library now. The head librarian seems less a confident diagnostician and more a weary administrator, drowning in accession slips for new books she cannot possibly pre-vet. The young assistant who misfiled the mill volume now wears a simpler, more practical uniform, less like a governess and more like a civil servant. There is talk, among the few whispering patrons, of a new open access scheme being tried in some cities, where readers could actually browse the shelves themselves. The very idea would have horrified an earlier generation, fearing the anarchy of unsupervised choice. But the tide was turning. Historians still argue about the precise moment of death for the system, but they agree it was less a murder and more a fading away, like a ghost starved of the belief that gave it form. The taxonomy of souls was being replaced by a simpler taxonomy of subjects. The great, flawed experiment in shelving personalities was ending, not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless sound of turning pages. pages the librarian no longer controlled. The final bell of the day sounds, a soft, resonant chime that seems to vibrate through the polished wooden marble. It's time to leave. You close your book, your mind full of Roman emperors and deep time, but also of ledgers, codes, and diagnostic glances. You return the volume to the desk. The librarian takes it, stamps it, files the ticket. She does not look at you with any particular scrutiny now. It's a mechanical transaction. The age of intense assessment is passing, its energy spent. You walk back through the galleries, now empty of readers, the long tables bare. But as you move toward the exit, you feel them. You walk among ghosts in the stacks. They are not specters of people, but of judgments. The shadows in the corner where the romantically susceptible were seated seem to hold a residue of frustrated yearning. The well-lit North Gallery tables thrum with the ghostly discipline of 1,000 improvement seekers. The air near the spiral staircase to the Forbidden Aisle is still thick with the allure of the restricted. The library's physical shelves have been reorganized countless times since, adopting the impersonal, efficient logic of Dewey or Library of Congress. The personality-based geography is gone. But the impulse that created it, the desire to sort, to predict, to guide and control the messy human encounter with ideas, never truly died. It just evolved. You step out of the oak doors into the twilight of a modern city. But the journey isn't over. You go home, perhaps to your own device. You open a streaming service or a bookstore app because you watched. Readers who bought this also liked, recommended for you. A shiver, faint but unmistakable, traces your spine. It's happening again. Not by a lone librarian's gaze, but by the silent, colossal gaze of an algorithm. It has diagnosed you. It has categorized you based on the digital crumbs of your curiosity. It has assigned you a shelf, an endless, scrolling shelf of content tailored to your predicted preferences, designed to keep you engaged, comfortable, and clicking. It is building a ledger of your mind far more detailed than any Victorian librarian could have dreamed. The goal is different, not moral uplift, but engagement and profit. But the mechanism of categorization feels eerily familiar. You are being shelved by a new, digital personality taxonomy. The thought here is that our modern algorithms, for all their complexity, often lack the one thing the Victorian system had: a human capacity for mercy, for a benign misfiling. The junior assistant who slipped Mill onto the wrong shelf is replaced by code that cannot rebel, that only optimizes for pattern. The debate the historians had about intent becomes moot. The algorithm's intent is simply to reflect and reinforce, creating a perfect, inescapable loop of your own documented tastes. The Forbidden Isles are now the things the algorithm never shows you, the ideas that lie outside your filter bubble, more effectively hidden than any book on a restricted balcony. Historians still argue whether the Victorian system was a primitive prototype of our own data-driven reality, or something fundamentally different in its moral ambition. But as you put away your device and prepare for sleep, the connection feels palpable. We still fear the unguided mind, only now we guide it not with paternalistic concern, but with predictive analytics. We still create shelves for personalities, only now they are invisible, digital, and endlessly personalized. The ghosts are not just in the Victorian stacks, they are in the cloud. The librarian's diagnostic gaze has been digitized, scaled to infinity, and turned back upon us all. We have not escaped the age of being shelved. We have perfected it. You lie in the quiet dark now, the echoes of the library's hushed grandeur and silent judgments slowly dissolving into the softer sounds of the night, the distant hum of the city, the gentle sigh of the wind beyond your window. The rigid world of the Victorian librarian, with its certitude and its constraints, feels like a dream from another century, which, of course, it is. It's easy from our vantage to smile at their honest, flawed attempt to map the human soul onto bookshelves, to see the arrogance in that diagnostic gaze. But perhaps, before we dismiss them entirely, we can feel a whisper of sympathy for the underlying fear, the fear of the unknown, unguided, and overwhelming power of ideas. They built their shelves to manage that fear, to create order from the chaos of a newly literate world. We have built our own shelves, our own algorithms, to manage a different chaos, the endless, overwhelming flood of information. The tools have changed, becoming invisible and omnipresent, but the human yearning for a guide, for a curated path through the wilderness of knowledge, remains. So as you drift towards sleep, let the image of those gaslit shelves fade. Let the stern face of the librarian soften into a historical curiosity. And instead, carry with you the gentle, reassuring thought that your mind, in all its glorious, messy, unpredictable curiosity, was always too vast, too complex, too wonderfully human to ever truly be shelved. It can wander, it can rebel, it can discover its own forbidden isles. No system, no matter how elaborate, can ever hold the entirety of a single, dreaming human spirit. That is your permanent, uncategorizable truth. Rest easy with it.